John Steinbeck is an amazing author, but if we are going to create a literary renaissance, I need you to write better than John Steinbeck. And today we are going to hear Steinbeck's 6 rules for writers. And I will help you integrate those rules so that we can carry the spirit of Steinbeck with us on the journey to create an educational awakening. And there are so many people out there who say rules for writers don't work, but I've noticed the people who say that time and time again are mediocre writers who have no who don't have, a growth-oriented mindset and will never end up on a bookshelf in their entire life because everyone behind me right now had mentors, stole, imitated, or had a whole community behind them supporting their creative efforts. Even original authors like Italo Calvino had parents who were professors, was raised in a very academic and intellectual environment, and manifested into an original writer after thousands of hours of practice and hanging around other authors and reading the best authors. That's how it's done. And if you guys don't know, Right Conscious is the headquarters of the literary renaissance, the literary crusade, where I am helping activate 50,000 authors just like you to go out into the world and create a literary awakening to help us regain all the land we've lost to social media, to AI, to video games, to low attention spans, to bad teachers who ruin people's perception of books forever. If it's not going to be you, then who is it going to be? But enough from me. Let us get to our first rule from Steinbeck. Abandon the idea that you are ever going to finish. Lose track of the 400 pages and just write 1 page for each day. It helps. Then when it gets finished, you are always surprised. And I would agree with this rule because one of the tenets of this literary crusade is that we do not launch books to zero audience. We don't do a pity launch where we put our book on Amazon and your girlfriend and a couple of your friends buy the book and it just fades off into the Kindle graveyard. We also don't release books that aren't good, and good books take thousands of hours to write. But during that process, you shouldn't be thinking of me saying, you got to spend thousands of hours. You shouldn't be worried about creating a literary renaissance. You should just be sitting with your work every single day, having fun with it. And Steinbeck is talking about the first draft here, which some people struggle with. There are some people out there who just can't get a first draft done, but they're really good at revision. So for a while and through the entire process, you have to take the pressure off. Writers putting pressure on themselves is the number one reason that writers fail and never write or just waste years of not doing anything. There's always something that you can be doing. You could always be writing a practice novel or a crappy short story or working on sentence structure or writing poetry or doing random things for fun. And that's what I encourage on this channel all the time. And that's the other component of the literary renaissance, that you spend years working on something big, but then you spend the rest of the time releasing fun stuff for free so people get to know who you are and you get a ton of practice in, because it's not a 3-year game. You can't just sit and become a literary celebrity overnight. Like, that really isn't a reality. You have to build your audience one by one, and that doesn't happen in 2 years. That doesn't happen in 5 years. You can't sit and tell your wife, hey man, or don't say, not hey man, hello wife, I need to take a year off from work because I have a plan and I'm gonna make us rich with books. It just doesn't happen like that unless you're doing like genre fiction. So you have to take the pressure off. You can't listen to other people's expectations. Like, oh, I've been there. I've had people say, well, why don't you write an erotica book? Why don't you write a sci-fi book? Why don't you do this? And it's like, no, I'm on a trajectory and it's going to take years, if not decades, for me to get there, because that's how long it took everyone else behind me, except, the Rimbaud's or the Keats or the whoever, who were already masters in their early 20s. But most of us, that is not the case. And so there is rule number 1, Moving on to rule number 2. And he's speaking of the first draft here. Write freely and as rapidly as possible and throw the whole thing on paper. Never correct or rewrite until the whole thing is down. Rewrite in process is usually found to be an excuse for not going on. It also interferes with flow and rhythm, which can only come from an unconscious association with the material. And Steinbeck is 100% correct here, that there are so many perfectionists out there who are just tinkering as they write. And I know there are some exceptions, who tinker the entire time, and then once they finish, that's the entire draft, and they send it to an editor or publish it online. But I really do think that the first draft is an unconscious process, and that is a joyous experience to be able to just let loose and get it down and not have any worries and get it down fast. This is why National Novel Writing Month, which is coming up in 2 months, is very fun, because you can produce a 50,000 word first draft with the community in a month. You're forced on Thanksgiving and other random days to get your novel done. It's a really fun experience. And if you think you can't get a novel done, if you haven't written a first draft of a novel yet, but you call yourself a writer, I'm not saying you need to finish it, but as an English teacher, I have had over 100 students, they were mostly 7th, 8th, and 9th graders, finish a first draft of a novel in a month. And a lot of those students weren't writers before that. In my class, I would give extra credit for anybody who could complete the National Novel Writing Challenge, and I would do it with them. And it was a fun time every single month. It wasn't easy, but everybody learned a lot. I remember one of my students, who could be listening right now, Lucas, he never thought that he was a writer, but his friends were doing it, and he did it. And he's done it 4 or 5 years in a row now and wants to be a writer one day. But he doesn't care. He's not revising in the middle. He's flowing. He has to wait until later to do all the revision. We need to have that same mentality. Revision is where everything happens. It is a totally separate process, which is also unconscious from actual writing. And even in revision, I think a lot of the time, like when you rewrite a scene, like sometimes a scene needs to be rewritten, but with the first draft mentality, just kind of that creative mentality. And a lot of authors do this. I've been to the Cormac McCarthy archive and the David Foster Wallace archive, and they did this time and time again. They would spend on each draft of their novel over 1,000 hours, if not closer to 2,000 hours on each revision. And a lot of that was they would literally write in the margins, I need to rewrite this entire chapter. And they rewrite the entire chapter. And then on the next revision, then revise that if they liked it. And then revise that 5 more times over the course of the 10,000 hours they would take to finish one of their novels. And I'm not saying you need to spend 10,000 hours on one of your novels, but most of the time, if you're going to write something like Blood Meridian or Infinite Jest, it's going to require a ton of time and a ton of space to get it done. So moving on to rule number 3, forget your generalized audience. In the first place, the nameless, faceless audience will scare you to death. And in the second place, unlike the theater, it doesn't exist. In writing, your audience is one single reader. I have found that sometimes it helps to pick out one person, a real person you know, or an imagined person, and write to that one. And this is actually one of the keys of the literary renaissance. And so you're hearing me say like, oh my God, you have to put 10,000 hours into Blood Meridian, but I'm not unrealistic. I understand that you probably have a job, kids, you don't have the time, you didn't sacrifice like Cormac McCarthy and live in a cabin so that you could write uninterrupted for 20 years, or you weren't like David Foster Wallace, who was kind of built and bred to be a fiction author and had the time and space to do it. That's not you, most likely. And spending 10,000 hours on a novel would probably take you 20 plus years, and that we can't do that either. But you may have to spend that amount of time if you want to be the best literary fiction author, if you want to be called a GOAT or enter the canon. But in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of micro genres and sub niches, you don't need a 10,000 hour novel to be the best in that. You probably only need a couple thousand hour novel to be the best in that realm. And you can create that realm by speaking. But first of all, by thinking, of a real person out there who you are writing to. I love nature poetry. It's all I really like to read in terms, if I could just sit down and read nature poetry for the rest of my life and like live a simple life, I would do it. I just love reading poems that involve nature. But as someone who's grown up and lived in the desert my entire life, I haven't seen too many desert poetry books. There are some out there, but the desert isn't very represented. And so I assume that there are people, even just in the United States with the 10 plus million people who live in a desert right now who are interested in nature poetry and thus very interested in desert poetry. And so when I write and release my desert poetry book, which is going to be released in 2024, I am not competing with Novalis or Rilke or Gary Snyder or the modernists. I am competing with them, obviously, and I'm trying to be at their level, if not better. But technically, I'm competing with all the desert poets. Technically, that's who I'm going to be judged in relation to. And if I say I'm re-energizing, refreshing, remixing desert poetry, People aren't going to question that, but you could do the same thing with whatever you are doing. You're a writer, be creative. What person out there is going to love your novel? And then flood them with information. Tell them that I am your Messiah. I am the one who has come to give you a novel, to give you a bunch of free short stories and poems and essays and content that you will love. And if that person will like your stuff and rave about it, then everyone else in that same field will love it too. And thus we have a literary renaissance happening if 50,000 people do that across all the separate fields. And it will work because we aren't tied down to a movement. Modernism or Dadaism or Cubism didn't work because there was a manifesto and everyone was a part of a movement. But I don't really believe in authority. I don't really believe in that. But if everybody is functioning independently, then it doesn't matter about what the movement is or who's running it, because that's what video games do. Think about all the video game designers out there. They're all just functioning independently. They don't care. And they're pursuing their vision. Same with YouTube content creators and all these other people. They're not, bowing down to the feet of a movement. We aren't in the sincerity movement or something dumb right now on YouTube. It's just happening. Anyway, so let's move on to point number 4. I do agree, though, that you should be writing to a specific person. And it's almost like it's very similar like in business, like create your product, create the perfect product for one person, for that avatar. And I think it would be good if you thought of that, because if you have a book right now, let's say, and you shouldn't change what you're writing. If you can't figure that, that's okay. But then all the free stuff you're releasing online, and if you're not releasing free stuff online, then what the hell are you doing? Should be geared toward that one person. You can kind of direct that artistic energy toward that. And it doesn't feel like, if you sat down and sometimes consciously directed your artistic effort in a novel towards something, that feels dumb. But if you were writing or creating an Instagram post or a short story, you could sit down and be like, okay, I'm gonna let my creative energies flow, but I am thinking of this person as I'm writing this writing this short story, and I want them to really enjoy it. That's not the end of the world. All right, moving on to number 4. If a scene or a section gets the better of you and you still think you want it, bypass it and go on. When you have finished the whole, you can come back to it, and then you may find that the reason it gave you trouble is because it didn't belong there. And this is true with everything. Like a lot of the time when you're writing poetry or writing fiction, sometimes the scene is there for an unconscious reason. Maybe there's a word or a phrase that needs to go somewhere else. Maybe the scene belongs somewhere else in the novel entirely. Same in poetry. But I know writers. I talk to writers all the time, every single day, actually, over on the Right Conscious Substack in my office hours. We also are reading 20 books simultaneously, which makes it the best and biggest book club in the world, IRL or online. I also post daily podcasts over there and a bunch of other cool stuff. If you want to join my book club and hang out with me daily, go check out the Right Conscious Substack. Link is down in the description below. But I talk to authors every single day, and I know some of them who've literally been stuck for months on a scene. I'm like, dude, just move on. It doesn't fucking matter. But an interesting thing you will know if you've written a novel before and try to do it successfully is that a lot of the stuff you write in your first draft is just crap. And that's something that a lot of people find hard to overcome. And that's why editors exist. That's why people, publishing houses pay $5,000 to $10,000, if not more, to hire an editor to edit your work. Or that's how much it would cost you at least to get a similar service, because their main job is to convince you and tell you that you don't need this, because a lot of your babies, a lot of these things that you absolutely love in your novel just have to go. And so let's go, everybody. You're going to have to cut. Moving on to step number 5. Beware of a scene that becomes too dear to you, dearer than the rest. It will usually be found that it is out of drawing. And that's harping on the same point that he was just saying, that anything that you become too sentimental about most of the time can become problematic, especially in a long form context, because writing is a communication to the reader. And a lot of people try to be avant-garde. They try to be sensational. They try to hold on to these things, but they just aren't good enough writers on a technical level yet to be able to carry an audience through that. And so a lot of the time, if you are a beginning writer or releasing your first stuff, you need to make it peppy. You need to make it good and carry us through. You need to go read some crime novels or, mystery novels and follow some of those principles to keep us entertained and keep us kind of transitioned and moved through the novel. That's something that I notice all the time, that the people who shouldn't be experimental are the new writers, especially the untalented ones. And no one wants to admit that they are untalented, and that's like a whole other conversation. But it's okay if you are untalented, that just means you need to put more work in. But when there are people like David Foster Wallace out there who was raised by two professors, was also kind of genetically high IQ and talented, was writing from a young age, then went to some of the best schools in the country for writing and dedicated himself to writing. By the age of 22, he was ready to write experimental stuff, because he had literally put across his entire life easily 10,000 hours into the English language, like a deep, deliberate study of it, going down to American usage and a bunch of other stuff. Most people have not done that yet. And so that's most of the time what I mean by talent, is that a lot of your favorite authors in the world that I talk about on this channel, Cormac McCarthy, William T. Vollmann, Italo Calvino, like so many others, even Toni Morrison, they had an immense upbringing. They had so much training before they became writers that it would astonish you. And that's how from the start they were able to be successful or write at a very high level. And it's like learning a language. The more you learn at an earlier age, the more proficient you'll be and the more integrated it will be for the rest of your life. And that doesn't mean to say that a person who is older can't learn a language, but it's going to take longer and be a lot clunkier to gain full fluency. And so it's not your fault. It's most likely your parents' fault. And last but not least, rule number 6 is if you are using dialogue, say it out loud as you write it. Only then will it have the sound of speech. And I would agree on this 100%, because a lot of people are scared. Like, I was like this for a long time. I was very scared of dialogue, because you see these conversations in books and they seem so realistic. They are deep and funny, and it seems like these characters would be saying that, and then you look at your dialogue and you're like, dude, this is flat. Because like dialogue is a lot of the time with great authors, they're like stand-up comedians, they are romance authors, they are like all these different things at once, and it seems realistic, and it's all happening in a random town in Arkansas, and you're like, dude, how are they doing this? How are they making this seem realistic? But the first and foremost, is just the gut check. And if you're saying it out loud as you're writing it or just immediately after, you will see like, okay, this is actually good. This makes sense. This doesn't sound wrong, because you automatically know in a novel when characters sound off. And this is something that a lot of beginner writers have. Like, it's just like, this doesn't seem right. But if you say it out loud and you have an objective mind, and more importantly, you've read a lot of books, so you have something to compare it against to, then you'll be like, oh, this isn't very good. I need to think about this deeper. And it's just practice. A lot of the dialogue, you hear advice about how you need to go out in person and listen. And that is true. And I would recommend that. But a lot of the time, it's just through reading and writing and tinkering with it and giving it maybe to your friends or your girlfriend or boyfriend, wife, whoever. They can kind of tell you if it's authentic. Like my sister, Victoria, she always used to just ram me. She was like, dude, this sounds terrible. Like, why would they be talking? She'd be like, dude, women don't talk like this. Like, what is this? This is terrible. Like, and I'd look at it and be like, yeah, you're right. Women don't talk like this. And so sometimes you do need second opinions with dialogue, and eventually you could take it away. And that doesn't mean that you aren't proficient, but it's just a very odd skill. And I don't want you guys to be scared of it, because once again, there have been many authors who have never written, who have never released stuff, or who have never really become great because they've been scared of dialogue. And so I love all of you guys. I want you guys to activate. I want you guys to write beautiful things every single day and come on this literary crusade, this literary renaissance with me. And I want to thank John Steinbeck. I want to praise him for all the great books that he's put out, because we can't have a literary renaissance with all the irony, all the logic broing, all the deconstruction that's going on right now. So praise to John Steinbeck. Praise to you for being here. And I will see you guys in the next video.